I've been a nurse for over 10 years, and my career in healthcare spans nearly 2 decades. Throughout my time in this field, one question always seems to arise when people learn that I'm also a narrator of scary stories. Have you ever experienced anything paranormal? The answer: yes. Yes, I have. Sometimes, when I tell these stories, I pretend they happened to someone else. It's easier that way, less personal. But the truth is, these are my stories, experiences that have lingered in the corners of my mind, haunting me during quiet moments. In healthcare, we often stand at the threshold of life and death. It's a place where the lines blur, where the living and the dead sometimes seem to coexist. Today, I'll share some of my encounters, moments that remind me how thin the veil between this world and the next truly is. My first encounter: the shave. I started my career as a certified nursing assistant, CNA, at a nursing home. Fresh out of training, I was eager but nervous, still finding my footing in a field that demanded so much emotionally and physically. For my first 4 weeks, I trained on the day shift before transitioning to nights. It was during this training period that I encountered something I would never forget. An 84-year-old resident passed away one afternoon. His children were traveling from out of town, and the staff had already prepared his body. He was bathed, dressed, and laid out in his bed. But there was one final touch he needed: a shave. Being the only male staff member on duty that day, the task fell to me. I hesitated at first. Shaving a deceased person wasn't something I ever imagined doing. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the room, the air heavy with stillness. The man's lifeless body lay there, serene but unnervingly still. As I prepared the razor, I felt a chill run down my spine. I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Despite my unease, I completed the task as quickly and respectfully as I could. When I stepped out of the room, I exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the heaviness that had settled over me. But something about that moment lingered. It wasn't just the act of shaving him, it was the unshakable feeling that somehow he had been watching me. The storage room incident. After completing my day shift training, I transitioned to the night shift. Nights at the nursing home were quieter, but carried an eerie stillness that seeped into every corner of the building. The nursing home had a large storage room used for broken beds, wheelchairs, and other equipment. It wasn't uncommon for staff to take their breaks there, sometimes even napping on the old beds. One night, around 3 a.m., I clocked out for my break. Feeling unusually drowsy, I decided to head to the storage room for a quick nap. The door was slightly ajar, and the dim light from the hallway cast long shadows inside. Assuming someone else might already be there, I entered quietly and didn't bother turning on the lights. An empty bed near the door caught my eye, and I lay down, letting the darkness envelop me. Just as I was drifting off, I heard a voice from behind the curtain separating the room. "Close the door," the voice said. Startled, I complied, pushing the door shut. The voice was calm, almost casual, and I assumed it was one of my coworkers resting in the other bed. I fell asleep quickly, but my rest didn't last long. The door suddenly swung open, and the room was flooded with light. Startled, I sat up to see 2 morgue attendants entering with a metal gurney. "Sorry to disturb you," one of them said. "We're here to pick up a body." Confused, I watched as they went behind the curtain. I heard them counting softly. 1, 2, 3. The sound of something heavy being lifted filled the room. Moments later, they emerged, pushing a body bag on the gurney. Before leaving, one of them turned to me. "Do you want the lights off?" I shook my head, too stunned to speak. When they left, I finally gathered the courage to peek behind the curtain. There was no one else in the room. To this day, I can still hear that voice telling me to close the door. It wasn't a coworker, it couldn't have been. That was the last time I ever napped during a night shift. The doppelganger years later, I worked as a registered nurse on a hospital telemetry floor. This unit often cared for patients with heart conditions, so emergencies were common. One night, a patient in his 90s was admitted for bradycardic episodes. Despite his age, he had stabilized well and was preparing for discharge. But just as he was about to leave, his heart rate plummeted, triggering a code blue. As we rushed to save him, an EKG technician who had just arrived turned pale. "Are you okay?" I asked, concerned by her expression. She hesitated before whispering, "I saw him in the elevator." Confused, I asked what she meant. "I was coming up from the lab," she explained, "and I saw him. He was in the elevator, smiling at me, but he looked different." Her words sent a chill down my spine. We were coding the patient he couldn't have been in the elevator. Despite our efforts, the man passed away. The technician's story stayed with me, a haunting reminder of how the soul might linger, even briefly, after leaving the body. Room 14. The shadow in the vent. During my time in the ICU, there was one room that everyone dreaded. Room 14. Staff whispered about it, sharing stories of patients who experienced sudden, unexplained complications there. One night, a critically ill patient was placed in room 14. He was young, only in his 40s, but his condition had rapidly deteriorated. As we worked to save him during a code blue, I saw something that still haunts me. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near the ceiling vent. A shadowy leg, long and thin, descended briefly before retreating into the darkness. I froze, unsure if my exhaustion was playing tricks on me. But then, I felt a tap on my shoulder. It was the house supervisor. "You saw that too?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, my unease deepening. Despite our best efforts, the patient didn't survive. His family chose to stop resuscitation, and he passed peacefully. But I'll never forget that shadow in the vent, a sinister presence that seemed to linger in room 14. The funeral garments, the 2020 lockdown brought countless challenges to healthcare. Families were often unable to visit their loved ones, leaving nurses to bridge the gap between life and death. One night, a critically ill patient of the same ethnicity as mine was admitted to our unit. Her family couldn't visit, but sent traditional funeral garments for her. I helped dress her in the garments before she passed away, feeling the weight of the moment. Her family's love was evident in every stitch, and I hoped she found peace. A week later, an elderly woman from my community was admitted to our unit. Though unrelated, I couldn't shake the feeling that the two events were connected. It was as if one soul had paved the way for the other, a subtle reminder of the interconnectedness of life and death. Reflections, these experiences have left me with a profound sense of wonder and fear about what lies beyond. As a nurse, I've witnessed countless transitions, moments where the line between life and death becomes almost tangible. Healthcare is a field grounded in science, yet these moments defy explanation. They remind me that there is so much we don't understand about the human experience. For those of us who stand at this threshold, the mysteries of the unknown are always close. She wasn't my patient, but since we were related, I decided to stop by her room just to say hi. It had been a long day, and visiting family always brought a sense of comfort to an otherwise stressful shift. The fluorescent hospital lights buzzed faintly as I walked down the sterile hallway, and the faint aroma of disinfectant filled the air. When I entered her room, she smiled warmly, her frail hands clasped together. Despite her condition, there was a strength in her eyes, a reminder of the resilience our elders carry. We exchanged pleasantries, and I promised to come back again soon. She chuckled softly, teasing me about working too hard. I left the room feeling lighter, unaware of the strange events that would follow. The following night, my coworker approached me during our rounds. "Hey, can you help me translate for the grandma in room 12? She's having a little trouble communicating, and I want to make sure we're on the same page about her care plan." I nodded, always willing to help when it came to family. As we stepped into her room, she greeted me warmly again, her face lighting up as if I were an old friend she hadn't seen in years. After translating for my coworker and ensuring the instructions were clear, my coworker thanked me and left to chart at the nurse's station. I lingered, sitting by her bedside for a few moments longer. We chatted about her health, her children, and the simple joys of life that brought her comfort even in such trying times. The conversation felt normal until she said something that sent a chill crawling up my spine. "Son," she began, her voice soft but steady. "The other night, a Hmong auntie came in here. She said her family couldn't visit her and asked if you could help her get dressed. She just wanted to thank you." Her words hung in the air like a thick fog. My heart skipped a beat as my mind raced to make sense of it. There hadn't been any Hmong patients admitted recently, or at least, none that I'd heard of. For a moment, I chalked it up to medication or a dream like confusion common among the elderly. But something in her tone, calm and resolute, made it hard to dismiss entirely. I smiled politely, trying not to let my unease show, and excused myself. After years of working night shifts, I decided it was time for a change. The odd hours and strange occurrences that seemed to populate those quiet nights weighed heavily on me. When I transitioned to day shifts, I expected a more routine experience. But the hospital has a way of reminding you that not everything can be explained. One afternoon, we admitted a young man in room 18. He was short of breath, his face pale and clammy. The diagnosis: a severely weakened heart. Our hospital wasn't equipped to handle such cases long-term, so the plan was to stabilize him and transfer him to a specialized facility. The team worked tirelessly, monitoring his vitals and administering the necessary medications. By 3 o'clock, a helicopter arrived to transport him. As I helped wheel his stretcher toward the elevator, I caught his gaze. His eyes were filled with fear, but there was also a quiet determination, as if he knew this was a fight he couldn't afford to lose. Once the housekeeper cleaned room 18, it sat empty, a sterile reminder of the life that had occupied it just hours earlier. At 5 o'clock, I was at the nurse's station with my coworker Jerry, discussing the day's events. The hospital hummed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, pagers buzzing, and the faint sound of a television in the waiting area. Suddenly, a flatline alarm blared from the monitor. Both of us froze, staring at the screen. The signal was coming from room 18. "That can't be right," Jerry muttered, his voice tinged with confusion. "The room's empty." We glanced at each other, then toward the corridor leading to room 18. The door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I felt a cold prickle run down my spine as I walked to the door, peering inside. The bed was made, the machines unplugged, and yet, the monitor insisted there was a heartbeat no more. 10 minutes later, our manager approached us with somber news. The patient hadn't made it. He had passed away during the flight. One of the hardest cases I ever handled involved an elderly woman whose body was failing her in every possible way. Her kidneys and liver had shut down, and the medications keeping her alive seemed almost cruel, prolonging her suffering rather than bringing relief. Her body swelled with fluid, her skin stretched taut and glistening under the fluorescent lights. Her breathing was labored, each shallow rise and fall of her chest a reminder of how fragile life is. The conservator, responsible for making her medical decisions, was unreachable over the weekend. This meant we had to continue every life-saving measure, no matter how futile it seemed. Dialysis wasn't an option. Her blood pressure was dangerously low, and removing fluids could kill her. Still, she remained a full code, requiring us to intervene at every turn. I spent my entire shift by her bedside, monitoring her vitals and adjusting medications, convinced she wouldn't make it through the night. But she did. When I returned the next day, I was astonished to find her still alive. Her condition had worsened, her fingers and toes had turned black from lack of circulation, and her eyes, when they fluttered open, seemed distant, as if she were already halfway to another world. On the third day, I arrived with a heavy heart, dreading what I might find. She was still holding on, her body defying logic and reason. After receiving my morning report, I entered her room to check on her. My focus was on her monitors, ensuring everything was stable, when something in the corner of the room caught my attention. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I turned, I saw him clearly. A boy, no older than 14, stood by the wall. His blonde hair glowed faintly in the sterile light, and his shirt, patterned in black and gold checkers, seemed almost too vivid for the dim room. He smiled softly, a gesture that seemed both kind and sorrowful, before stepping behind an unused ventilator. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. I moved quickly to the corner, but he was gone. The rest of the morning felt surreal. I couldn't shake the image of the boy or the strange peace his presence brought. At 11 o'clock, the woman's heart finally gave out. The monitors screamed as we rushed into the room, performing CPR for what felt like an eternity. But deep down, I knew it was her time. After 20 minutes, we called it. The room fell silent, save for the hum of machines being turned off one by one. As I cleaned her body and prepared it for transport, I thought about the boy. Who was he? A grandson? A long-lost child? Or perhaps something beyond my understanding, a guide here to take her hand in her final moments. In my 2 decades as a healthcare professional, I've seen things that defy explanation, moments that linger in the corners of my memory, refusing to fade. I don't have all the answers, and maybe that's the point. The Hmong auntie, the flat line in the empty room, the boy in the corner, each of these experiences reminds me that life is more than what we can see or measure. It's a tapestry woven with threads of the mysterious and the unexplainable. To this day, I find peace in knowing that the elderly woman is no longer suffering, and perhaps the boy, whoever he was, helped her find her way to rest. Thank you for listening to my story. Take care, and may your day or night be filled with peace.